Hello, everyone. Good morning to those of you who are joining us on the West Coast. Good afternoon to those of you who are joining us in the East Coast, and good evening to everyone joining us in the United Kingdom and across Europe. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ethan Marcus. I am the Director of Communications for La Hermandad Sephardi de America, the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, the national umbrella organization for the Latino-speaking Sephardic communities of the United States. We're so excited to have you for the distinct honor and pleasure to welcoming really a guest who needs no introduction, but we'll get one nonetheless, Senior Rabbi Joseph Dweck, who is the Senior Rabbi of the S&P Sephardi Community of the United Kingdom, one of our sister communities around the world. It's really such an honor and pleasure to have him here with us today. Just a reminder to everyone, this is all done through our brand new Sephardic Digital Academy initiative, a wonderful online database and center of learning throughout the Sephardic world. We have classes on Sephardic Torah, Halakha, philosophy, Ladino language and culture, cooking, and so much more. If you're interested in learning more about these classes, please check out our website at sephardicbrotherhood.com/Sephardic Digital Academy. One last note I'll mention for this class in particular, this class has been generously supported by Mark and Alana Ben Ezra. If you're ever interested in supporting other classes or sponsoring a future class, please reach out to us. You can find out more on info at sephardicbrotherhood.com. Now, without further ado, just one note on Rabbi Joseph Dweck, who is the Senior Rabbi of the S&P Sephardi Community of the United Kingdom. He's actually an American-born rabbi and has lived in Los Angeles, Brooklyn, and in Jerusalem as well, where he studied at Yeshiva Hazon Ovadia under the tutelage of former Sephardic Chief Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. He also studied psychology and philosophy at Santa Monica College, California, and received a Bachelor of Arts degree in Liberal Studies from Excelsior College. Rabbi Dweck received his Semikha rabbinic ordination from Rabbi Ovadia Yosef of blessed memory under the auspices of the Sephardic Rabbinical College of Brooklyn, New York. He also received a Master's of Arts degree in Jewish education from Middlesex University at the London School of Jewish Studies. Without further ado, Rabbi Dweck, bechavod.
Thank you, Ethan. And thank you, everyone. I've been really looking forward to this. This is my maiden voyage with the Sephardic Brotherhood. And I'm very grateful to Ethan and to Rabbi El-Nekaveh as well. You know, we've spoken, I know Rabbi El-Nekaveh for a very long time, and for giving me the opportunity to be able to share with all of you on this series that we've kind of agreed to do a 3-part series. And the general gist of the series is looking at what it means or how it is that we look at being Sephardim in the 21st century. And it's a very broad subject, right? It's a very broad idea, and there is no question that there are many opinions as to what that means and what it should be. And there are many ways really that we can approach it. We can approach it from a perspective of what is the philosophy of studying Torah. We can approach it from an aspect of culture and, you know, worldview. And I'm going to do it my way, because it's the only real way that I can do it, but I'm going to do it in a way that kind of draws from both of those aspects, right? The culture and the aspect of Torah. And so this is kind of how it is that I'd like to do this with you in these 3 parts. And I want to say that really it is an honor to be able to share with you. And I recognize that noon is not necessarily the most convenient time for everybody. And so I'm so grateful for those who have come to spend this time with me. And I recognize that as, you know, for me, it's a tremendous kavod. So I would like to look at from the first discussion that we have from a very broad principled perspective, right? What are the principles that we're dealing with over here? Because when we say Sephardi, we may mean very many things, yeah? And so I'm going to present today what it is that I think of when it is that I think of that initially. What is the central core for that as far as I understand, and how it is that I teach and how it is that I engage in my work and involvement with my kahal, with the kehilot that I have the honor of being involved with, and for the general, just the way that I teach and learn in this world. And the next lecture, what I'd like to do is to look at the history of it, right? To look at how it is, but recent history more, to be able to look at how Sfaradim and Ashkenazim interacted and what was the experience of interactions after coming out of the respective countries that we lived in. And although there was some cross-pollination, there was nothing near to what it is that we experience today and what our grandparents' experiences when they kind of moved out and came into places where they saw all different cultures and all different approaches to Torah, mitzvot, and Judaism. What happened there? And in the third and final discussion, I would like to look at the future and how it is that we're dealing with things now and what it means for us to be able to take the principles that I'd like to speak about today and apply them in terms of our lives as they manifest with us now. And so let's get started with it. Yeah, and what I'd like to do is I suppose I'll speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and I will then be happy to answer any questions that people have in terms of the presentation. What I'm going to open with is to say that what we call Sephardi approach, or what even the Ashkenazim call as Ashkenazi approach, which there isn't a blanket approach. I mean, we have to really be honest and clear about this, right? That among the Sephardim, there are different approaches. There is not one single way of looking at the world among the Sephardim, and there is not one single way of looking at the world among the Ashkenazim. But it is possible to say that there is a bit of a predominance, right? That there are aspects that we recognize and have an affinity to. And that is what I'm going to share. In other words, what is my experience as what I would call as a Sephardi Jew, right? I consider myself a Sephardi Jew, even though my ancestors, my grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents for about 300 years, if not more, lived in Aleppo, Syria. That's not Spain. So if I look at Sfarad as a strict term, yeah, I'm borrowing the term because I didn't live in Spain, my grandparents didn't live in Spain, my great-grandparents didn't live in Spain. But back somewhere, they did, right? Both on my mother's side and on my father's side. And then they arrived on the shores of Halab, of Aleppo, and they stayed there for a very long time. But they brought with them something. And that is the aspect that I'd like to look at, because the Spanish aspect, perhaps more accurately, the Andalusian aspect, right? The southern Spanish aspect, that we will now very much look to Rambam, look to Maimonides as the grandfather of Andalus, even though he left Andalus when he was only 20 years old. He had to leave because of the Almohad tribes that were coming in that were much less tolerant than the previous tribes that were there in the region. He nonetheless never stopped signing his name, Moshe ben Maimon Hasfaradi, the Spaniard, yeah, because he felt very strong and very close to the Torah, to the way of looking at the world that he learned from his father and that he learned from the Hachamim that were in the Andalusia, in Cordoba, at the time that he was growing up. And so that is what it is that I want to speak on. That is what I want to share. And even with that, I'm not going to be speaking about all of it in its fullness. I'm going to be speaking about what I believe is the broad, overarching philosophy that runs through it, that holds it, that binds it. And that ultimately, for me, is the defining factor of my Judaism today and how it is that I understand my service of God and my involvement with the world. But it does not begin in Spain. Every stop that it takes, it evolves and it develops. But what I'd like to look at with you today is that it doesn't begin in Spain. This is part of the nation of Israel. This is one of the ways that our people look at the world. And there is not just one way that the nation of Israel looks at the world. As a matter of fact, I would suggest that there are two predominant ways that the people of Israel look at the world and their relationship with God and their own responsibility. And I believe that that goes all the way back to before we even came down to Egypt. I believe that it goes back and that the Torah teaches us about it all the way to the time of Yaakov Abinu. And what is it that I'm referring to? In broad strokes. And of course, we really have no choice but to speak in broad strokes, because we only have 45 minutes. So we will develop the ideas as best we can over these 3 lectures. But I hope that, the opportunities that I have to share with the members of the Brotherhood and the people that are listening we'll have an opportunity to further develop these ideas in various ways and details. But today is broad strokes. And what is the overarching principle to which I am referring? The question is, how do I understand God's manifestation in this world and my responsibility in interacting with it? Again, how do I, as a grandchild of Abraham Avinu, that's essentially what we're dealing with here. I mean, let's talk about it in its broadest terms. When we talk about Jewish, that's a very specific term, isn't it? Right? Jewish means coming from Judah. And the reason we call ourselves Jews is because we come from Judah, because the only thing that we had left after 10 tribes were lost was the kingdom of Judah. And so the citizens of the kingdom of Judah, which essentially were led by monarchs which were descendants of King David, coming from the tribe of Yehuda, of Judah, were called Yehudim. And that's why, for example, in Megillat Esther, which is written just after essentially the expulsion or the leaving of Eretz Israel after the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, you don't see us referred to as Yisrael, which is how we're referred to essentially almost throughout the entire Tanakh. We're referred to as the Yehudim, the Jews. And we're referred to the Jews, which is a very limited way of speaking about our people, because it does not hold the broadness and entirety of who we are. And that's why I do think that it's extremely significant and meaningful that once the state of Israel was established, we called it Israel. We didn't call it Judea. And there would have been a very great reason to call it Judea. It would have been completely understandable to call it Judea because we were Jews coming back to our homeland. Why would we not call the homeland of the Jews Judea? But we didn't. We called it Israel. And the reason we did so was because we understood, and when I say we, I mean in collective terms. Obviously, there were individuals that didn't agree, but this is how it manifested ultimately. That we recognized that we had to re-establish ourselves as a nation, rather than just a religion, an ethnicity, a culture. Because before we were any of those things, we were a nation. And if we look back to the readings that we're reading now, right? What are we reading now nationally? What is being read publicly in the Torah nationally? The story of Abraham and Yitzhak and Yaakov, and all HaKadosh Baruch Hu, all God promises to them is land. It is striking that God does not promise Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob a Torah. As a matter of fact, nothing is mentioned with regards to a Torah. All that is mentioned is a covenant. And in that covenant, land. And that land is clearly established for nationhood. The name of our nation is not Jew. The name of our nation is Israel, Israel. And that is the most important thing for us to remember. You could talk about Sephardim, you could talk about Ashkenazim, you could talk about everything that you want under the sun. But until we understand the core of who we are, it is useless to talk about the detailed derivatives of who we are. We are Israel. And what I am suggesting is that there have always been different strands within the nation that had differing philosophies as to how we should relate to God, his manifestation in the world, and our involvement with the world that he created. Where does it show itself in the Torah? It shows itself in the Torah in the children, at least in the most prominent way. I believe that it shows itself even before that. But in the most prominent, more defined way, it shows itself in the actual Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. Who's Israel? Yaakov. His children are Bnei Israel. And there are two prominent children that for all intents and purposes are rivals. And they are rivals in philosophy, not just in petty personal issues. And who are they? Yosef and Yehuda. They're rivals. Now, Yosef, it seems at least, from the way that the Pesukim present the story to us, that he had quite an affinity and closeness with his father, didn't he? And his father had a great closeness to him. His father also had two wives, which were very different. Although they were sisters, they were very different. We do not have time today to go into the difference between the wives, but what I do want to do is show you again broad strokes about the differences between the children. Yaakov believed, and this I want to ask everyone to please focus and pay close attention to, because this is the major foundation of the idea. Yaakov believed that the world that God created was a broad and elaborate, detailed expression of God. That the world was an expression of God. And that the way to engage with God was through his world, through the integration of his world, through the interaction of his world. This was something that Yosef, his son, embraced, and Yehuda, his son, and at that time many of the other siblings, rejected. Yehuda rejected his father's approach, as did Shimon, as did Levi, and even Reuben, certainly the oldest of the oldest four children. And so there is a story, some of you will know it, of course, but I'll remind you, that when Yaakov leaves the house of Laban after over 20 years of being in the house of Laban, he goes to a place called Shechem. And it says that Yaakov comes Shalem, Ir Shechem. He comes to the city of Shechem whole, complete. His family is intact. His wealth is intact. He's made an exorbitant amount of money working with Laban. His investments have paid off tremendously. He is whole, complete. And he comes into the city of Shechem. And it says, Vayihan et penei ha'ir. The Hachamim, one of the readings of the Hachamim on Vayihan et penei ha'ir, which simply means that he essentially camped at the foot or at the opening of the city. The Hachamim say Vayihan means he came in to set up markets with the city. He wanted to engage in commerce with the city. He wanted to integrate into the city. He believed that the appropriate way for him to live with his family in this world, given the understandings and beliefs of his grandfather Abraham and his father Yitzhak about God being one, and everything in this world being expressions of that one entity, that the mode of his engagement should be through the world around him. And so he engages in that city. And his children go in, and his daughter is abducted and raped by the mayor of the city, right? By the leader of the city. And at that point, the approach of Yaakov is very different than the approach of his children. Yaakov, for some reason, right? We're not going to get into the details of this right now because there's a lot of contention around this, but Yaakov is still interested in negotiating with them about interacting and holding together. And his children come into the negotiation and they say the only way we will interact with the people of the city is if they engage in our covenant and engage in circumcision. They do this in front of their father, and their father is very happy, right? We're going to engage with this city. We're going to interact with the society. And what ends up happening, you will know, is that Shimon and Levi take matters into their own hands. And when the people are at most vulnerable post-surgery for the circumcision, they massacre the entire city and kill everyone and reject their father's approach. And what does their father say to them about this? Their father says to them, Achartemoti, you have made me look ugly in the eyes of the people. It's a very strange word, right? He says, Achartem, you have made me look ugly in the eyes of the people, which means that I can no longer integrate into this society because you have completely isolated us from being able to have any interaction. And so it actually says that God needed to personally set up security for them as they were walking through and leaving the city so that nobody would attack them because they had no integration anymore into society. So what happens here is that Yaakov is interested in integration and his children are not. They disagree with him fundamentally. That this is not the way that Israel should be interacting in the world, that we should maintain ourselves as a silo and engage as we need, but not genuinely. We have to hold ourselves apart, separate. The only one who agrees with their father really is Yosef. And so his father, he wants to show his affection for his son, and beauty is very important to him, right? He tells his sons, you made me look ugly. Why does he tell them that? What's the deal with the ugliness? Just say, look, you ruined this, you ruined the plan. No, he has to tell them, you made me look ugly. Why? Because Yaakov saw beauty as the interface between people, between him and society. And isn't that true? That is the interface. You look at the world and what it is that we find attractive, right? That even that word, it's attractive, it attracts us. We find place in it to connect. We are repelled by the things that we do not find attractive. It's huge when it comes to marketing, is it not? Everything is about beauty. And so Yaakov didn't look at it superficially. He understood that it was an interface. And he wanted the beauty not to just be skin deep. But he did not underestimate the value of the interface. So what does he get his son that gets his philosophy? What does he give his son that understands his philosophy? A new suit. He doesn't give him a gift certificate to the Jewish religious goods store, right? He doesn't get him, a new shas, set of, religious books or anything. He doesn't do that. No, he gets him a new suit. And it's that very suit that ends up being dipped in blood and presented to their father, saying, Dad, look, I don't know, Hakirna, can you check, is this the new suit that you got for Joe? Because unfortunately we found this and he's gone. Have your suit. So there's a very deep controversy here. Jealousy, yes. Sibling rivalry, yes. But it goes much deeper than that. It is a deep philosophical difference. On the one hand, a vision of integration, of embrace, of beauty, of interface. Why? Because the mode of interacting with God is through the creation that he made. It's his expression. The alternative? No. It is a dangerous game. You start interacting, you start integrating. Our sister already was raped. How much more do you need in order for us to be able to have this problem? You have any idea how many toxins there are in that world? You build a wall, you hold strong, you isolate, and you engage as necessary, but you do not do what Dad and Joe are doing. And it runs throughout the story. Joseph later accuses his brothers of being spies. He essentially says to them, you all are spies. That's the way that you engage in the world. All you care about is what you can get out of things. You don't actually integrate into a world. I mean, look at what Joseph did. He became Egypt. I mean, literally, he became Egypt. Did he forget who he was? Did he lose his identity? Miraculously, no. But his clothing was Egyptian clothing. His speech was Egyptian speech. And he accused his brothers of spying. And that was not just some fluke idea. He meant what he said. He said to his brothers, you do not integrate, you do not interact, you are not faithful in your involvements. You dip in and out at will in this world. That, my friends, is a difference of vision, an argument, a schism in the people of Israel that runs to this day and has never gone away. And there are points on both sides. I mean, you know, the fact that the brothers looked at Yosef and said, he's a disaster, we've got to get him out of here. He's going to run us all into the muck. They were not very far off about that. That danger is always there when we integrate into society the way that they were suggesting. And there was a descendant of Yosef that got into some really hot water as a result of it. We call him Yerovam ben Nevat. Yerovam ben Nevat was the first king to secede from the monarchy after King Solomon. He threatened Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, who was the heir to the throne, that if he raised taxes on the nation, that they would secede, and that he, Yeroboam, would set up his own kingdom. Rehoboam calls his bluff, raises taxes, and Yeroboam secedes with 10 tribes. Do you know what tribe Yeroboam came from? Yosef's, Ephraim. And you want to know what the crazy thing is? The crazy thing? I always find this astonishing, right? There is one detail. When we meet him, and Ahiah Shiloni, he's the prophet at the time. And Ahiah Shiloni comes to Yerovam and he says, listen, God is with you, actually. He thinks that you actually have a chance here to bring these 10 tribes away and to rule over Israel. The beginnings of Yerovam ben Nevat were very promising. And at that scene, where Ahiah Shiloni, the prophet, is talking to Yerovam ben Nevat, the one who is rebelling against Solomon's son, it gives us one description of Yerovam. You know what that is? I'm going to show it to you and put it up on the screen for you so you could see it. It's astonishing. It describes him in one way. It says, Vayhi ba'itahi. Can you see? Yeah, Vayhi ba'itahi. And it was in that time, Vayerovam yatsa mirushalayim, and Yerovam left Jerusalem after challenging Rehoboam ben Nevat, Rehoboam, the son of Shlomo. Vayimtza oto Ahiah Shiloni hanavi. Ahiah Shiloni, the prophet, finds Yerovam leaving Jerusalem. And what does it? One detail it tells me about Yerovam. V'hu mitkaseh b'salma hadasha. He was wearing a new suit. Really? That's the only thing you could tell me about him? He's wearing a new suit? Yeah, you know, I mean, he was a Joseph person. They cared very much about this stuff. It ends up that the new suit is ripped into 12 pieces by Ahiah Navi, saying to him, here, you could take your new suit because you're getting 12 tribes. God's going to give you everybody. But I still find it astonishing that that's the thing that he's defined as. His interface was beautiful because he believed, like his great-great-grandfather, that the integration was essential. Why do I mention Yerovam ben Nevat? Because Yerovam ben Nevat went wrong. The approach of Yosef is a dangerous approach. They're both dangerous approaches for different reasons. But the approach of Yosef definitely has its perils. And it ends up being that Yerovam ben Nevat becomes so consumed in his own standing and how people see him that he loses sight of the goal. And he becomes obsessive, despotic, dictating law and life to the people. And he led all of the people into idol worship as a result of it. He becomes the epitome of evil leadership in Israel, to the point that Rambam says everyone can be, here in the second thing over here on the screens, everyone has the ability to choose their lives and be what they wish to be. Everyone can either be a tzaddik like Moshe, a righteous person like Moshe Rabbeinu, so Moshe is set as the top righteous person, or a person can be a rasha ka Yerovam, or he can be an evil man like Yerovam. Yerovam is said as the most wicked. So there are perils. But what I'm suggesting is that the vision of wanting to, of believing that, our mode of engaging with God is through integrating into the world, embracing the world, seeing and understanding God through the world that he created. And that is a legacy not just of the Sephardim and the Andalusia. It's a legacy of Yosef, and ultimately a legacy that comes from Yaakov Abinu all the way back to the city of Shechem. There is a rivalry, though. Yehuda doesn't agree. And that's never gone away. Yehuda is concerned about the perils. But there is enough in Yosef's approach that is meaningful because it has run all the way down to this day. But I do believe that it is an approach that for those who wish to include traditional observance, study of Torah, engagement in mitzvot, those who wish to include those things feel overwhelmingly today that there is a pressing aspect of it that requires us to choose one over the other. I'll say in more plain terms, there is definitely a feeling today that if I want to hold a life of Torah, I have to sacrifice the world. And if I want to live in the world, I have to sacrifice Torah. Of course, it's not as binary as that, but there is no question that there is such a message that is put out, at least in some aspects, some prominent aspects of the Orthodox world. And what I am saying, I'm suggesting that the tradition of the Sephardim was that one does not have to come at the expense of the other. To the contrary, it is the mode of understanding and connecting to God. And that I want to show you from Rambam himself. So have a look at the screens. Rambam talks about the love of God. And he says the love of God is a commandment. We say it every day in the Shema. We say, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. You are to love the Lord your God. B'chol levabecha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol me'odecha. With all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your being. And so Rambam, as he does with all the mitzvot of the Torah, talks about that. And he asks the question. Over here, he says, Ve'he'achi haderech le'ahavato. What is the way that a person should approach the love of God? I mean, a person would say, look, I don't. I mean, what do you want me to do? Well, Rambam says, well, you can work on that. There is a way to love God. And what Rambam essentially says is, we're going to read it, but to preface it, what Rambam says is, to know him is to love him. So, how do you know him? He says, B'sha'a shitbonen ha'adam, b'ma'asav ubro'av haniflaim gedolim. That when a person contemplates his actions, his creations that are wondrous and great, and from them he sees the wisdom behind their creation, that it's unfathomable. Miyad hu ohev, he immediately loves, because he realizes that everything that means anything to him or her in this world comes from that entity. Is that not true? Is it not true that whatever it is that I love in this world, whatever it is that moves me in this world, came from that source according to our belief? When we say Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, that God is one, the unity of it is that there's no other source. He is the source for all things. And so if there is anything that you and I love in this world, he put it out. So when you start to look at what it is that he made and you start to feel the sweetness and goodness and grace and beauty of this world, you realize that that is not just something arbitrary. You realize that that is guided to you, that is made for you to be aware of. You immediately fall in love. And how am I doing that? By looking at the world that he created. Rambam writes about this in many other places. But that one is potent. Not that the others aren't. And the reason Rambam writes for this is, we have no other way of knowing God. God in his essence is unknowable. All we have are the expressions of God. And as we come to study them, we come to know him. And as we come to know him, we love him. And that is what is behind Yaakov and Yosef's approach. That if you don't spend time engaging in those things, you miss out on knowing God. And that is at the heart of their endeavor. It's not we need to know things. It's not we want to have experiences. It's we want experiences because through them we know God. We want to know things because through knowing those things we know God. That is what drives the entirety. And yet, Yehuda will point to that and say, yes, lovely. However, it's perilous. Because you may engage in those things and simply engage in the experiences and forget the source of the experiences and lose yourself in those experiences. And it's not an easy argument to negate. But it is one that the Sephardim, those who are in the tradition of Rambam, and not all the Sephardim are, but I believe that the Sephardim who are, members and involved in the Brotherhood certainly are, say that we understand that the world is an expression of God. And our desire to know him is through those things. And that is how we will do it. That will be the motivation for us. But we have to do it like Yosef, and not like Yerovam ben Nevat. We have to do it like Rambam. And what that means is, we have to know who we are. As much and as important as it is for us to know who God is. Because is it not true that in any relationship, in any covenant, and we are talking about covenant over here because we go back to Abraham Avinu, is it not true that in every relationship and in every covenant, it only functions when there are two distinct entities that come together? And what that means for us and God is that I have to be me in my interaction with God. And that means that I have to know who I am. not live in some delusions, not live in some imaginary elements. I have to know who I am. And part of knowing who I am is knowing what makes me different than everybody else. And that's why Yosef was able to live as viceroy of Egypt, to be Egypt, and to hold strong through and through. Because there was no question in his mind as to who he was, who was his father, and from which place he came, and what were the vision of the world that his grandfather held, and his understanding of God. And that's evident in Yosef's life and in his speech and in his involvement, at least in the way that the story is told to us. And so for the Sephardim, in a nutshell, we have always lived in a way in which we were comfortable in society, in the world, the way that things ran. We did not feel that we had to live behind walls. You visit Cordova today, and they for tourist purposes put little Jewish stars down on the floor to try and mark where the Jews might have lived. But what they say when they're honest is say that the Jews integrated into the society. They lived all over with everybody else. Now, I will say that I am not suggesting that the Jews who did need to live behind walls did so at will necessarily. There were many times in which we were forced behind walls, in which the circumstances of the society forced us to live completely separate and isolated. What I'm saying is that when we have the choice, when we have the ability, what do we choose? And I'm saying that our derech, our way, has usually been to choose integration, to choose seeing God through the world that he created. But I'm also saying that it is true that it's perilous, and that the way to ensure security in that peril is to instill profound awareness of identity. And that requires education. It requires genuinely giving over to our children who we are, what we think, how we understand, what lens do we see the world that we are engaging with through? What is the framework through which we integrate the vast information and experiences that we have in the world? Because let's be honest as well, everything in the world is miscellaneous. And that has a great deal to do with modern society, which we'll talk about in the third lecture, if you're still around and you're gluttons for punishment by the third one. But the reality is that the world on its own as it is miscellaneous. We provide the meaning. And everybody has a different lens through which they see the world. If you talk to an engineer about the world, he or she will talk to you in a very different way than you will talk to a linguist about the world. If you talk to a designer about the world, they will speak to you in very different ways than a philosopher might. All of us have different lenses through which we see the world that is on its own miscellaneous. So what is our framework? What is our lens? And when I say our, I don't just mean my individual lens, just Joe Dweck. I mean, what is mine in terms of my place, my people, my line of the nation of Israel? The people that I call Sephardim. Well, the overarching philosophy is that the world is an expression of God. And that, as Rambam writes, my responsibility is to love God, to know God, to engage and embrace God. And the way to do that is through his creation. That did not begin with my ancestors, the Sephardim, but it was delivered into their hands and they embraced it. And so while on the one hand, we recognize that the study of our Torah, the precious Torah, the wisdom that has run with our people for over 3,000 years, various modes and formats, is my greatest treasury. It is what my lens and framework are built from. the engagement with the world is also the whole connection that I have, or the source of the connection that I have with God. And that I do not see it like some of my brethren, and they have their reasons, but my family, my people, do not see it as an elaborate distraction. We do not see the world as an elaborate distraction in which we get higher levels of piety by avoiding. The contrary. The more we know of it, the more we know God. The less we know of it, the less we know God. And as Rambam writes in Hilchot Teshuvah, the less we know God, the less we can love him. Because the love is in direct proportion to the knowledge. And so those are the overarching broad strokes. And I would like to look at next time with you, again, if you will join me, at the actual recent history. What happens when an element of the nation comes together with another element of the nation that has such differences of opinion and approach and interact with each other? Do the ones who feel that the embracing of the world and the comfort in society feel self-conscious around those that think that it is dangerous and unsafe and unwise and inappropriate to be engaged and comfortable in society, that rather we should dress differently, isolate, keep to ourselves? How does one play on the other? That's something that I'd like to look at with you, again, empirically, next time. And in the third lecture, as I said, to look at how it is that that manifests now in the 21st century, at least in the first part of the 21st century, with the rapid development of our world and the reality as we see it in society and technology and thought in front of us. How does it happen and manifest at this time? With that, I thank you for your patience in coming through the openings with me. I hope that it wasn't too convoluted, but I'm happy to hear any questions if there are.
Thank you so much. Beautiful shiur for our first in the three-part series. If anyone has any questions for the rabbi, please enter into the chat box. We'll be happy to read them out and ask them away. A first question here that comes up, Rabbi, from your experience and just looking at this kind of length of Jewish history, really starting from, as you said, Yosef and Yehuda, has there ever been a way to reconcile these two positions, in a sense, bring kind of these polar opposites of understanding how to interact with the world as Jews into kind of cohabitation? Has there been a movement to do it? Has there been a chance to do it? Is it even possible, would you say?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we certainly hope that it's possible. If we look at it historically, the Torah definitely presents it at the time of King Solomon, right? The time of Shlomo, and where you have a unified kingdom. And there are also issues with regards to Hanukkah that have to do with this, which perhaps around Hanukkah, if we have time, we can probably talk about it a little bit more. But essentially, Hanukkah deals with this problem very much. Because when you look at it in terms of their interactions with the Greeks and how they were involving themselves in the world and, what it is that they presented to us, we had to take a very good look in the mirror and see, what is it that we were missing in terms of either the Yosef side of things or the Yehuda side of things, and how it is that we were supposed to incorporate. But I do believe, without getting into too much detail, I do believe that it is possible. But one of the most important ways to do it is to be able to listen to and recognize the values and merits in the other. And at the same time, be able to hold with security and strength our own vision. And so the way that I like to look at it is, it's perhaps a crude analogy, but I think nonetheless a useful analogy. It's like a symphony orchestra, right? What you want is harmony. What you want are different instruments and different sounds that are special and unique, finding the ability to come together, be who they are in tandem with the other elements that are there. And I honestly believe, I genuinely believe that is literally what we're watching happen right before our eyes. The very fact that we actually need to talk about this together is because we're experiencing an integration that we feel on the one hand, we're losing ourselves because it's kind of consuming us. But on the other hand, we want to be able to hold ourselves at the table. And so what we will do, I very much believe that we will do, is we will learn to find unity. We will learn to evolve into that unity while holding very much the unique strand that we bring to the national wholeness of our people. But we do have to start thinking in national terms and recognizing that we are 12 tribes, or at least we have some legacies of 12 tribes. And so what does it mean in the manifestation today of the Sephardi vision, the Sephardi culture, the Sephardi ethos? How does that come into the wholeness that is Israel? And why do I need my brother that doesn't think like me? And how does he or she help me to be able to be me? So we've been for many years in a time where we were the only ones. There was no other way of doing things. And now what is bringing to us? Well, there's a whole bunch of other ways actually that Israel has learned to do things. What say you? What will you contribute and what will you embrace? And that I think really is at the heart of it. Again, I know that I'm speaking in very broad terms, but in broad terms, that's how I would approach.
We have more questions here, some wonderful questions in the chat. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Chacham, you mentioned that the issues that we face today, and we're going to get into this probably in the second, third lesson. How compatible or consistent do you think your philosophy, the philosophy you presented here, are in line with kind of the modern Sephardic world that has been kind of polarized between taking a very extreme right or totally secularizing? How, especially, we see this in Israel and we see this certainly in the States.
I think that we're watching that on so many levels in so many different areas, right? These polarizations that are happening, in society. And I don't think it's new, but I think that it's definitely happening at a bit more of an accelerated level. Like I said, there are many aspects among the Sfaradim. Remember, Rambam and his vision was not universal, even among the Eastern Jews, right? So there was a whole bunch of Babylonian Jews, for example, that did not necessarily agree with Rambam and his approach and the way that he saw the world. So they're not new today, these differences of opinion. Again, I think that it's important for us to be able to understand what each one might contribute to the whole of that vision. In terms of being compatible, what I'm suggesting today is being compatible. I'm saying that extremes hold inherently red flags. Because what happens when one lives in extremes is they lose the nuance and responsiveness that is essential in being able to live in society, and for that matter, to be able to engage with God. It's just not possible. Because you will know that if you live on either extreme, politically, religiously, socially, whatever you want, whatever extreme it is, you are able to anticipate almost every single time or in every scenario what either extreme will respond to any given situation, because they toe a line. But that also means that there isn't a tremendous amount of novel thought. So it's reactionary and not responsive. And what ultimately we need to try and do, and what the nature of kind of finding center space is, to be able to say, well, how do I temper the extremes of either irreligiosity or the lack of connection and embracing of history, identity, and so on, and culture, and on the other side, complete movement to holding strong in isolation and digging heels into what we know, as opposed to what it is that is developing. We need to find the center. The center has to hold. And what I mean by center is a conscious, responsive, contemplative addressal of the world and how it works. And why is that important? It's not just because it's prudent. It's because that's how you relate to God. Any time that we believe that we've got God down and we know already what it is that he's going to do and say, we're out. Because one of the beautiful lines of the Navi is, Lo derachai darkechem velo machshavotechem machshavotai. Your ways, God says, are not my ways, and your thinking and not my thinking. So you're always going to have to anticipate, watch, see where I'm going. It's a wonderful game that we get to play together. But the minute that you think that you've got me between your ears and you know how it is that I'm going to act, you're God, not me. And so that's something that we have to deal with. Right. So in terms of the compatibility, it's not so much a question of specific to Sfaradim, or Ashkenazim or anything. It's a question of how it is that we live viably in our lives. And that can play center, responsiveness, the openness to working definitions as long as they work, and being able to relinquish them when they don't, is the way that a viable life works. And so that can be placed in any spectrum.
Another question here. Would the Chacham say that Yosef is, in a sense, a thrive model Judaism, and Yehuda is much more of a survive model Judaism? And where are we now in terms of that dichotomy?
That's a great question. That's a great question. So it depends, right? Yosef would probably say that Yehuda is a survive model. But Yehuda would very likely say it's not a survive model, it's a thrive model. And it's the only way we can thrive as ourselves. Because what will happen if we don't do what we do is we will dissipate and lose ourselves. So there's no sense in living when you have lost who you are in that living. And so Yehuda's belief is to thrive, it requires security and isolation. And then we can do what we like. So it's really a question of the perspective. And I think that both Yehuda and Yosef have merits, but they have to be tempered, as I said, right? It's something that has to be able to find unity and connection between the two. So it is possible for the Yehuda way of doing things to be survival mode, but it's not imperative that it needs to be that way. It all depends on how it is that it's done and what are the components of it.
With that, I want to take a moment and thank Rabbi Dweck so much for this wonderful first class in this three-part series. We'll be back. First of all, thank you so much for everybody for your wonderful questions and participating. I'm sorry we didn't get to all. If you have additional questions, I'd be happy to forward them along to Rabbi Dweck as well. I'm sure he'd love to hear them from you. We'll be back on November 24th, Tuesday, that's in 2 weeks, for the next in the three-part series. Make sure to check out the website for any updates as well. One last note I'll make, Rabbi Dweck will be holding a very special tribute to Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, the former Chief Rabbi of the United Kingdom, who recently passed away. He'll be holding it today at 3:30 p.m. New York time, 8:30 p.m. UK time. We encourage you all to join if you're interested. It should be a really wonderful program, especially because Rabbi Dweck had a very close relationship with Rabbi Sachs. So we hope you all will join that.
If I can, Ethan,
please.
I realize that on that particular flyer, because it's to my regular kind of audience, it doesn't have all of the how to log in. So I'm going to put here on the chat.
Sure, please.
I have my Zoom ID and the pass, right? So the Zoom ID is before, and then the pass is 220170. So I just put it up for everybody. I don't know if you can kind of jot it down, but that's the way that you can access it on Zoom. If you put that in, that's where it'll be tonight.
Great, thank you for that.
Also, I don't know anybody has Instagram. If you want to hear it on Instagram, I think you can search Rabbi Dweck on Instagram, and I have an account on Instagram. I put it out there. Yeah.
Great, excellent. I appreciate that, Rabbi Dweck. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for all you've done.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you all so much again for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful day. Take care.
Bye-bye.